everyone, welcome to my presentation, Storytelling That Engages and Compels Action. I'll be honest with you, I was surprised and really honored when I was asked to put this together. All of you who are listening to this are actually doing the work that will essentially save our planet's future. There's really no other way of putting that. So I thank you for all that you do and hope that I'll be able to add something today to your efforts. My name is Shannon Germaine and I'm a student filmmaker and I'm also just 16 years old, so in addition to talking about storytelling and the role film can play in making change in our world, I hope to give you a unique perspective from a teenager's point of view. A little about me. I started filmmaking when I was 12 years old with my YouTube channel, Nick's the Norm. But I wanted to do more than just post my latest skateboarding tricks. I wanted to make a difference in the world. So when I was annoyed by the government shutdown back in 2018 because it was really hard on some of my friends' families, I posted a parody of Ozzy Osbourne's Crazy Train called Shutdown Train. And no lie here, the shutdown ended the next day. Which I suppose is my first lesson I'll share with you today. Correlation does not imply causation. But you probably already knew that. Since then, I started doing documentaries, and my first one, Plastic Crisis or Oceans in Peril, won the high school division of the One Earth Film Festival's Young Filmmakers Contest, which emboldened me the next year to enter my newest documentary, Code Red: The Clean Air Act's Battle Against Climate Change, under the college category, even though I was just 15 since I've been dual enrolled in college since I was 14. And I was proud to be their first prize winner in that category this year, the youngest they've ever had in that category. I won! My films have also won awards from C-SPAN, Planet 911, and Grand Prize in the Redford Center Stories Challenge. This year, I was honored to be a judge in the Redford Center Stories Challenge, which is likely the only time I'll ever be pictured with Robert Redford. You know I had to show that off. And I think storytelling, especially through film, has a huge place in environmental activism, especially when we want people to take action. In fact, according to Paul J. Zak, founding director of the Center for Neuroeconomic Studies, when blood was taken from study participants before and after telling them a story, they found that, quote, character-driven stories do consistently cause oxytocin synthesis. Further, the amount of oxytocin released by the brain predicted how much people were willing to help others. So what exactly does that mean about storytelling? Simple. If you tell someone a story, they're more likely to want to help you. And of course, we need more help in environmental battles and causes that promote equality and social justice. Another study showed that in the courtroom, quote, stories evoked emotional responses that actually created more credibility in the legal claims being made and that further actually created empathy from them, meaning the judges, in their judicial thinking and decision-making. In other words, the stories beyond the facts of the case impacted their rulings and decisions. So this also tells us that if you need a good lawyer, find one that's a good storyteller. Storytelling creates a better experience of your message. Harvard Business Review also talks about the power of storytelling, explaining that when information is shown through a standard PowerPoint presentation, it activates the language processing parts of the brain called Wernicke's area and Broca's area. But when the information comes in the form of a story, other parts of the brain get involved. Quote, for example, sensory details like, the client was as excited as if he had won the lottery, engage a listener's sensory cortex. Action words like, drive this project home, engage the motor cortex, all leading to a more connected and richer experiencing of the message. But ultimately, I think for me, storytelling makes people understand things more clearly. I only have to look to the day that Greenpeace invited me to participate as a speaker in this co-op. Right away, I looked up the description and saw words that, to be honest, I simply wasn't familiar with yet. Data justice. So I did what every good American does, and I Googled it, which brought me to an article in the Lancet describing what exactly data justice is. And I read and I read, and I scrolled and I scrolled, and was still scratching my head and not understanding exactly what they were saying, until I came down to this paragraph. Quote, last autumn, the US saw this exact description of data oppression play out in real life in a, quote, widely used U.S. healthcare algorithm where Black patients were systematically underdiagnosed and received lower health risk scores than their white counterparts. Why? The algorithm used healthcare spending as a proxy for medical needs. But income is a good predicator for race in the U.S., with Black people being largely represented in lower socioeconomic groups. Additionally, Black patients receive a lower level of care in the healthcare system, resulting in fewer visits to healthcare services and lower usage of health insurance. And finally, I had a clearer understanding of data justice. They told me a story. They gave me an example. If I had written it, I probably would have preferred to make it a little more personal, actually describing one specific person who was underdiagnosed and how that affected their life. You see that technique used by fundraisers all the time. How they describe a larger need by delving into one very specific example, their storytelling. But even as it was, that example in the Lancet article was enough to make me not only better understand data justice, but also be horrified at the idea of Black people not being diagnosed just because of a faulty algorithm. Now the words data justice make me feel something. Now they make me want to take action. And that's exactly why storytelling is so important to the environmental movement, especially when we're talking about topics that can feel so overwhelming, like climate change. And I think that a lot of the topics that nonprofits have to deal with are also so thick with statistics and numbers and data that everyday people can feel overwhelmed by them. And if they're overwhelmed, then they're less likely to take action. So now that you understand why storytelling is so important, I'd like to break down some of my favorite techniques that tell stories while also, frankly, inundating people with a ton of information. And I think it might be useful for me to take a few minutes to show you my micro-documentary, Code Red: The Clean Air Act's Battle Against Climate Change. And then I'll break down some of the techniques that I used.
Folks, we got to listen to the scientists and the economists and the national security experts. They all tell us this is Code Red. The nation and the world are in peril.
This is going to be our new normal, and the effects that we're seeing from climate change are the crisis of our generation.
In my community and throughout the world, we are already seeing the effects of climate change.
Climate change is not just a threat for the future, but it's actually a real problem in the now.
Scientists and forecasters who study the connection between climate change and extreme weather say the rapid rates of sea level rise are accelerating the frequency and intensity of severe weather events.
It's a threat to humanity, that it's a threat to the United States, which will become worse and worse.
We're seeing people drown in their basements in Queens, New York because of flooding and rain. They're seeing that more territory burned down in the United States just since the first of the year than it makes up the entire landmass of the state of New Jersey. They've seen hurricane with top winds of 178 miles an hour. I mean, all of a sudden, people are seeing these things happening they never thought would happen.
And the federal government is taking measures to protect us from this crisis. But its primary weapon in this battle is over 50 years old, a law that was written long before climate change was even making headlines. The Clean Air Act of 1970 provides the basis for the vast majority of federal efforts to reduce the impact of climate change.
The Clean Air Act was first introduced in 1970, back when the kind of this notion of climate change was very much still on the fringes.
The Clean Air Act, in my opinion, is one of our nation's most successful laws. It's actually saved millions of lives since it was enacted. And the reason is that breathing dirty air is actually really bad for our health. Every year, something around 350,000 people die from exposure to particulate matter pollution. So it's kind of like a COVID pandemic happening every single year just because of our use of fossil fuels.
One of the reasons the Clean Air Act has been successful in fighting climate change is because of its flexibility, giving power to the Environmental Protection Agency to review and update air quality standards based on current conditions.
And the idea was that, of course, as time goes on, new air pollutants might arise, and the EPA needed to be able to address new things that Congress hadn't envisioned.
In 2007, the Supreme Court put this flexibility to the test.
In April, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 in favor of plaintiffs' argument that EPA is authorized to regulate automotive greenhouse gas emissions under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act.
This is an opinion that could have some pretty significant and far-reaching impacts.
But the flexibility of the Clean Air Act also makes it vulnerable.
Any law needs enforcement and implementation by the executive branch. And what we had with the Trump administration is an administration that really was more interested in coddling the polluters.
I feel that the United States has tremendous wealth. I've made that wealth come alive. And I'm not going to lose that wealth. I'm not going to lose it on dreams, on windmills.
Science denialism and climate denialism was something that was just too prevalent in the movement. And because they didn't like the policies of the left, they decided that the problem of climate change was fake as well. And that's not how science works.
That sort of interference in science has really been harming people across the country.
Since coming into office 1 year ago, the Biden administration has been undoing more than 100 Trump-era regulations that favored fossil fuel industries and weakened essential environmental protections, including the Clean Air Act. So what happens here depends on who's in here and who's in here.
There was a time when these environmental issues and clean air and clean water were not considered partisan issues. And that time was 30, 40 years ago when we passed a lot of our landmark environmental regulations and laws in this country.
Back in 1970, you did have a lot of support among Republican elected officials for cleaning up the environment, and they showed great leadership.
Every year that we delay action, we continue to emit more greenhouse gases, and that pushes us closer and closer to higher temperatures, more climate chaos, all of those bad things.
I think there's been skepticism from people more on the conservative side of things or the Republican side of things, thinking that people on the left are just using climate change as an excuse to introduce all these other kinds of policies and agendas that would impact the economy and American society and all those kinds of things. So I think that's one problem, that there's been kind of this shift on the Democratic side towards tackling climate change using everything rather than specifically looking at the issue of reducing emissions.
But the Clean Air Act is not a strong enough weapon in this fight.
But by itself, it's not going to be enough, probably, and we do need Congress to take further steps to make sure that we're able to fully meet the climate challenge.
We need to vigorously enforce the Clean Air Act and ultimately to strengthen it.
The Clean Air Act was last updated in 1990. For it to be an effective weapon, we need it to be strengthened to stand up to the changing climate and the constantly changing political climate of Washington, D.C.
Because there's been too many years since there's been a clean air bill, and this notion that the president wants this bill so badly, I'm not so sure the president wants this bill so badly. I want it badly. I'm not so sure the president wants it badly.
The time is now to update this vital law.
This is the United States of America. There's not a darn thing we can't do. Thank you.
Can someone please forward my film to the president? Because I totally think he needs to see that old footage of himself. Am I right? So as you just saw, I have lots of statistics and interviews and data that I needed to present. But I wanted to convey it in a way that made people automatically feel something. And you can tell what I wanted them to feel from the opening I chose, which takes the viewer right back to that day in December of 2021, when those deadly tornadoes struck several states, making headlines. So rather than just showing footage, I wanted my audience to feel like they were right there in the middle of the action. So I took some footage of me running down my basement steps, the lights flickering out, and then the flashlight coming on. I opened with drama. I opened with action. Opening with action is a very popular technique with writers. For example, with a classic-style fairy tale, you might have an opening that starts with, "Once upon a time in a faraway land, a princess lived in a beautiful castle where she sang to her friends the songbirds about how she longed to find her prince." These days, people would have clicked or scrolled away from that story before they even got past the words "once upon a time." Perhaps a more effective way to open the same story would be something like, "The thundering of hooves scattered a flock of songbirds as the princess raced her horse away from the castle and tore across the countryside to find her prince." A little more action, a little more drama, and a little less standard stereotyping. I mean, really. But of course, you're not writing fairy tales. But that same kind of technique can be used when telling stories about our environment or data injustice. It's like the difference between opening a story you might tell with this: "Nationwide, 9 of the top 10 years for extreme one-day precipitation events have occurred since 1996. Please help us stop climate change." Or this: "Storms destroyed the farm where Julie and her parents lived. Now she and her sister go to bed hungry, and her parents worry they will have to sell their farm. Extreme weather events are on the rise, hurting families and communities. Please help us stop climate change." So even when you're presenting data, you can show some action. And when you do, don't forget to invite your audience to enter into the story themselves. Make them feel a part of it. As Stephen King once said, quote, "An opening line should invite the reader to begin the story. It should say, 'Listen, come in here. You want to know about this.'" But that opening scene of me running down the stairs isn't the only time we visit my basement in my documentary. That's why I'd like to next talk about one of my favorite storytelling techniques: circular narrative. Because toward the end of my documentary, I circled back to where my story started, reintroducing the person in the basement. I used this technique again in the same documentary, where I open with the president's voice.
They all tell us this is code red. The nation and the world are in peril.
And then I end it with the president's voice again.
This is the United States of America. There's not a darn thing we can't do. Thank you.
I circle back to the idea. I like using this for several reasons, and these are all just my opinions, but I think there might be some validity to them. First, I think people like the feeling of completion. It's like seeing that period on the end of a sentence. Revisiting the teen in her basement reminds them of how the story began and gives them a cue that says, "Oh hey, we're about to end the story." The same goes for when the president comes back on for the ending. We know that the story is now over. Second, I think it makes the viewer feel a little better about themselves, a little smarter, and even more comfortable. They see that teen and are like, "Hey, I remember her, I know her." They see the president and are immediately reminded of what they already have been told, that he made an important speech after those tornadoes struck. They feel smarter and better about themselves for now knowing it. Third, when people read, a lot of the times they just skim the words. That's why in writing, it's so important to subtly revisit the same ideas if you want people to actually learn something. Well, for me, in film, I think there are also the equivalent of skimmers. Especially these days when a lot of people don't give things their full attention. They might be watching my film on YouTube, but they are also checking their email, making spaghetti, or texting their friends. That's why circular narrative can be so effective. It takes care of a lot of the problems that storytellers face. I think a good and really obvious example of circular narrative is in my film The Ripple, which is just 90 seconds long, so I'll have you watch that really quickly here. Maybe environmental justice is a ripple. Turn on your car and line the pockets of oil companies, raise the temperature of the earth, and cause a rise in the sea level that displaces entire communities. Click that buy button to purchase a product made by sweatshop workers, shipped on a plane that adds to our carbon footprint, stuffed in a box made from trees that could have been cleaning our air, and filled with bubble wrap that will last longer on this planet than you or I will. Bite into that burger and don't think about the mistreatment of the animals, or the dangers posed to the workers, or the 3.1 gigatons of greenhouse gases produced each year by the meat industry. Everything we do causes a ripple so far-reaching, it can make you feel like it's all just hopeless anyway. But back up a sec. Maybe that ripple isn't about guilt. Maybe it's about power. Because if everything we do impacts our world, then the power isn't with someone else, it's with us. And when we make responsible choices and raise up our voices whenever someone does something that we'd never allow to happen in our backyard, because all people are our neighbors and all the world is our backyard, that is when we will see and hear and feel the ripple that is environmental justice. You can immediately see that I used the same technique. I opened with a girl throwing a rock into the water. Maybe environmental justice is a ripple. And I closed with the same girl catching the rock. That is when we will see and hear and feel the ripple that is environmental justice. I literally put it on rewind and ended the story exactly as I opened it. I did the same thing with my plastic crisis video, which is longer, so I won't have you sit through all of that one. But you can see it on my YouTube channel, Nix the Norm, if you're interested. But I'll just show you the opening and then we'll watch the closing together and you'll see what I'm talking about.
In an underwater paradise, a plastic nightmare.
I'm going to tell you about a company. A huge, powerful company that's quietly doing something that affects every one of us. According to EarthDay.org, they are dumping the equivalent of one garbage truck full of plastic into our oceans every minute of every day. And they're getting away with it. In fact, not only is no one stopping them, but they are also projected to double that rate by the year 2030. And then by 2050, they'll double it again.
We're finding plastic in the food that we eat, the water that we drink, even the air that we breathe.
Outraged yet? Ready to picket outside their headquarters, boycott their products, and demand action from the President and Congress? Well, that might be a little difficult, because you're a part of that company. And so am I. That company is humankind. And together, we're dumping nearly 25 million tons of plastic into our oceans each year. And now I'll cut to the ending. Because remember that company I told you about? That company that's dumping all that plastic waste into the ocean? The good news is, you're not just a part of that company. You are on the board of directors. And so am I. And when we challenge the President and Congress to take action, we can change the direction of this company we're a part of, and the course of history.
We know that we have to take on the plastic pollution crisis.
Plastic poses a risk to human health.
We are supported by the ocean.
We need some legislation in order to help this crisis.
Ultimately, comprehensive U.S. federal action is needed.
So I opened with a metaphor about a company, and then I closed with that same metaphor, making it another example of a circular narrative. But what happens in between the opening and the closing? Well, that's the fun part, and that's the part where we get to deliver all sorts of compelling information in interviews and statistics that might ordinarily bog the story down or make it sound more like a research paper. It's like a story sandwich. You might have heard of the story sandwich back in school. Usually when people talk about the story sandwich, they say that the beginning and the end are the bread, and then the meat, lettuce, and cheese are things like the characters, the climax, and the solution. But in my version of the story sandwich, first off, we're not using meat because I'm a vegetarian, but also the beginning and the end are still the bread, but the insides of the sandwich, the cheese, lettuce, and tofu, are the data that I need to deliver to the viewer. So my hope is that I'll get the viewer sucked into a story, all that lovely oxytocin that scientist Paul Zak talked about in that Forbes article will get released. Then their brains will be inundated by all my information. And then right at that point where they might get bored, I bring it right back to my story. I did the same thing in Code Red, putting all my facts and interviews in the center so that they all feel like a part of the larger story. A very personal story in a way, of a girl who is racing to her basement during a tornado warning. But how do we keep someone engaged throughout the story we are telling them? These days, I think it's a growing problem because attention spans are getting shorter and shorter, even as our world's challenges get bigger and bigger. In fact, according to a Microsoft Corporation study in 2015, people's attention span is generally about 8 seconds long, which is about the same attention span as a goldfish. If you're a filmmaker like me, the news is a little less grim. The average watch time for a video is 2.7 minutes, according to the video marketing company Wise Owl. I can concur with this to a degree. On my YouTube channel, Nick's the Norm, you can see right there in my analytics that my average view time is about 3.5 minutes. So clearly, my subscribers are more evolved than others. The point is, as attention spans dwindle, using video to express your messaging is more important than ever. Not just because of dwindling attention spans, but also because, quote, video content typically performs best with most algorithms, based on the fact that it captures a viewer's attention for longer. And throughout your messaging, you need to remember to constantly change things up for your viewers. Give them something new to look at or listen to. And throughout this program, you've actually been seeing some of my favorite tools to keep people engaged. A really simple thing you can do is change your camera's point of view, like I did when I interviewed Dr. Tim Donaghy from Greenpeace last year for Code Red, or when I interviewed David Pinsky from Greenpeace the year prior. Another easy technique is to zoom in slowly or jump in suddenly. The simple change in what the viewer is seeing will wake them up. But sometimes, subtlety isn't what we need. So that brings me to my favorite tool to do this, and if you've dabbled on social media at all, you might have heard of it. It's called Canva. And it's kind of like PowerPoint for YouTubers. It's filled with stock photos and films and all the tools you'll need to get your message across. A ton of it is available for free and doesn't even require attribution. But if you're like me, you'll want even more. So do what I did and ask your parents for an annual subscription because they have some great premium content that you can use. And it makes for a much better gift than the skateboard I got for my birthday last year. But you already know how that ended. Sound effects can also transform visual aids and make them more engaging. For example, this graphic I use for Code Red keeps people's attention a little better, I think, because I added in the passing of the years in the upper right corner, and a clicking sound each time a year passed. Let me show you the clip to refresh your memory.
Closer and closer to higher temperatures, more climate chaos, all of those bad things.
I think adding sound effects to images can really come in handy when you're presenting data that you want people to read, because it calls their attention to what you want them to see and keeps them engaged in what you are presenting. Free, no attribution sound effects and music can be found in so many places. My favorite, hands down, is right on the YouTube audio library. You can also find sound effects in some editing software. I actually prefer editing in Adobe Premiere Pro, but they don't have free music and sound effects. But if you use Apple iMovie, which I used back when I did Plastic Crisis in the Ripple, they have lots of free, no attribution required sound effects. Of course, just remember that when you're using all these images, sounds, music, and films from Canva and other sources, that you must make sure that you are using the kind that are no attribution required. You can also find plenty of websites that offer free videos, photos, and sound effects, but watch out because some of them are not reputable and you might end up using something that you don't have rights to, or worse, downloading malware onto your computer. But now that I've inundated you with all of my favorite storytelling techniques and tools, don't forget that it's the story itself that will really make people engage with your message. Don't lose it in a bunch of effects that might distract from the message you are trying to convey. See my point? Because even though that 99-cent app you bought might be really cool, your effects should complement your story, not confuse people or steal the show. As Ann Cristiano and Annie Niemand stated in their Stanford Social Innovation Review article, The Science of What Makes People Care, quote, "Storytelling is the best tool we have for helping people care about issues. People are more likely to remember information they get in narrative form. Stories have the unique power to convey new perspectives and thereby lower counter-arguing, increase perspective-taking and empathy, and capture and maintain people's attention." Or put more simply by French filmmaker Jean-Luc Godard, Quote, "Sometimes reality is too complex. Stories give it form." So I hope this presentation has helped to give you a new insight on storytelling from a 16-year-old's point of view. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at nixthenormfamily@gmail.com or on YouTube, or reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thanks so much for watching, and for all you do to help make a better tomorrow for my generation and those that will follow.